also some people just don't care, and it's a way to like throw them something that they understand. And if they do care, if they're interested in music like this, like they probably have all their own thoughts about the word itself.
But do you think that sometimes it might put off people who might be interested otherwise when you give them this like completely vague term that offers no discernible characteristics about what they actually might hear in a lot of ways?
Yeah, that's true.
That's what frustrates me.
I agree with that. I think that experimental kind of like toes this line of like becoming off-putting to other people in a way, just in a similar vein of like just calling something noise. Like I kind of like take a similar like I don't know pitchfork towards like noise that you like experimental like the term. Just kind of I don't think that there's like it's not accurate.
What about people who do know? I mean, what about like music history? Do you feel that you're tied in some way to the history of experimentalism? I mean, certainly being in New York, like the downtown experimental scene and like that sort of thing.
Sorry to interrupt, but semantically, I always thought it seemed like that people brought around the word experimental to replace the term avant-garde because it was more approachable.
Yeah.
Because basically everything we call experimental now would have been called avant-garde like 40 years ago. The avant-garde, right? And it just was a catch-all for like new and possibly experimental or edgy or whatever. And then it was like now experimental is becoming off-putting. But I think that word was to be not, it's not like I'm avant-garde or above anybody, or I don't know, you know?
Well, that's an excellent point.
Term used to became off-putting, right? Avant-garde became off-putting. And then,
because it's military.
Yeah. And then it was like, oh, experimental, and now that's the new off-putting.
And now experimental is scientific.
Right.
So now that science is in the quantum versus relative mode, it's like, well, okay, experimentalism doesn't quite mean what it used to, and we're not really sure what it means anymore.
Yeah.
So now as culture makers, operating with these terms that come from things that we don't do, and we're trying to do something, you know, there's this whole new music.
Ah, the cult of the new.
The cult of the new. So, what's the difference between experimental and new? Is really what I would love to know.
New music doesn't usually, like, I don't know, for improvisation, I never hear improvisers say that.
Yeah, it's
always like an
academic thing.
or at least composed.
Yeah, composed.
Yes, but again, avant-garde and experimental and new all seem like surrogates for genres which have yet to be defined. Because you could throw so many things into that category. New tells me, you know, it was created, you know, in the last whatever time period.
I mean, the thing I wonder is, are definable genres actually going to come out of this? Or in a lot of ways, I feel like this is actually the end of genres. You know, I don't know. I mean, I feel like
now.
I feel like I feel like a lot of what's going on here is not about creating new genres. It's about ending genres and ending discussion of music in that sense. And that's what I would love to see is more people trying to encourage ways of, you know, come to something. It's okay if you don't like it or something like that.
But will that end? When will that end though?
I don't know. Maybe never.
Because it's kind of a way to I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with capital. With capital, like people want to make money off of something, right? Like they want to like package it, so they want to have it approachable or have like a term to put next to it, sellable.
I think, I mean, this is kind of straying for sure, but I think a lot about like the function of experimental music, and I'm sort of like dissatisfied with even like presenting it as music for music's sake. I'm thinking about like, because you were just saying like the end of genre, and like then what does it transform into from there?
Like transference of the experience.
Like yeah.
Multitude
but
of
like
varying
that's
experiences.
how can we like, I don't know, that's more of a question that has nothing to do with words, but how can we cradle that to make it worth people's time? I'm not like, of course it's worth people's time.
Yeah. You convince people that.
It's funny. So many of the people who make weird music around me, like
That's another term.
weird music. I say weird music in a very friendly, like welcoming way. Oh, you're a weirdo.
Yeah, and I
would love to hear what I'm sorry to cut you off. I really want to hear what Hot Date has to say on this particular topic.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of the guys that you play with and a lot of the venues in which you guys play, and I think that the question of weird versus experimental versus like noise is really pertinent to what you guys do. If not, it's okay.
No, I mean, I think to me it just goes back to like, for experimental, it's just the degree of like preparation. Not to say that it's not prepared, but that it's not a prepared like commodity. Like it's not like we're gonna write a song and rehearse a song and perform a song. It's more open-ended than that. So to me, that's where the experiment comes into it. Like even though you, like what you were saying, like you do all your experimenting at home, you know, but it's still like, at the end of the day, like you're gonna bring this thing out, and it's like, it is kind of an experiment in a lot of ways, you know. So that's where I see it, as opposed to more structured things, you know, where it's about just like, you know, really preparing like a thing to like put out, you know, just like, you know, as opposed to just like, here's an experience that could go in a lot of different directions. So that's, I don't know, for me that's why I don't shy away from experimental as a term, because it seems like it is kind of experimental. For me, at least for my approach.
That aspect of the music makes that music integral to live performance. And I think the live performance aspect of everything that we saw here tonight is essential to what's being done, because a lot of it is being created in the moment. A lot of it is, you know, it comes out specifically in that performance, and it's not non-repeatable.
And that was something that's interesting, kind of, the series is potentially somewhat similar in its lineups to Valerie's curation, which she was trying to coin the term performance music, which basically just acknowledging the situation, or like you're saying that somehow the context or the people who are there, the temperature of the room, those kinds of things are acknowledged factors of the practices. Which I think is relevant to what we're experiencing.
And if you're considering things like that, like the temperature, the amount of people, the size of the room, the decibels of the music being played, then it starts to go into what many would consider a scientific realm of inquiry.
Why?
Well, because you're taking quantitative values into account.
But even with structured music, as you would put it, and I remember just a few weeks ago asking this one girl who had performed a concert playing like composed music, asking her, do you improvise? And she said, well, what is improvisation? You know, like technically all performances, even if they are structured, even if they are composed music, can be arguably improvised, because it's never the same anytime you would play it. You know, even though you're still playing notes on the page, it's still different every time you play it, just due to the circumstances, due to the temperature of the room, or like the audience, or you know, whatever kind of energy you're feeling, or like, you know, maybe accidents that you didn't prevent, that sort of thing. So kind of like begs the question, what really is improvisation? How much can you actually control at any given moment? You know, so like essentially everything is improvised.
I have a question. So if you're looking at this, kind of taking the temperature of the room, judging the factors that are specific to the performance around you, doesn't that make it relational in some way?
Well, the word relational is a tricky term.
Yes.
I'm gonna avoid that entirely. No, it's a very good question. We have to avoid it.
I'll take a written response.
That's the next talk then, because we have to concentrate on a very specific problem, which I think is the use of experimental. It's so useful as a catch-all, throwaway term. Well, it's experimental. You know, you might like it, you might not. It's experimental. Like, really, what are we saying when we say that? Because I say that I make experimental opera. It's not experimental. It's fucking new opera, and it's American. I'm sorry. I have to say experimental so that I can apologize to people who are expecting Mozart.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
and I have to do that.
Exactly.
Sometimes.
Well,
Like
that's-
there's no
that's like-
way around
Yeah,
it.
I know the guy that runs this
You.
experimental
Everywhere.
theater company or experimental theater.
Sorry, say it again.
No, like Paul Bargetto, who used to
Oh,
do
yeah.
Underground
Yeah.
Zero.
Yeah, we're
when
doing
he
Underground
moved-
Zero this year.
Oh, really? When he moved to Warsaw,
I know, but he's gonna be back.
he was talking. This is a few years ago. I don't know him that well, but we were just ended up. We were like chatting at a party, and I was like, he was like, yeah, well, one of the reasons I like Warsaw is because, or Europe in general, is because what we call experimental theater over there is called theater,
Right.
and like kind of what we call theater is their children's theater.
Yep. Pretty much.
And I think that there's some things like that in Europe as well with music, where like there's stuff we would call like experimental jazz that they would just call jazz.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think it is the apology in a capitalist culture for something that isn't marketable.
Yeah.
And I think
You know-
David brought that up as well. I mean, capital. You're totally right. I mean, it's about capital. It's about the ability of capitalist systems to sell certain types of things that makes experimental a useful term.
Alternative is also very.
Oh
hard
God!
to
Don't even
catch
talk
all.
about alternative.
So how do you feel that or not in relationship with the spaces that you perform in, or who book you because you're experimental, or like when you're touring, how you reach out to spaces with the idea that you are what they're looking for, or that they will like it.
I mean, that's the time I do the most thinking about this question, is for things like that, when I book a gig or try to write a grant proposal or something. And it's frustrating. I tend to just try to describe things, just say things like it's improvised and acoustic. Which are
I
like
love that
quite
section.
literal. It's hard to say that's wrong. Hopefully it's not like an apology, kind of like the word experimental. Maybe. But it's also vague, and sometimes people don't know what you're talking about.
For instance, I booked the
Wait.
show not having it. Sorry, just to interrupt. I booked this not naming it what is experimental music. Because once everybody came together, then I was like, we can have a talk back. So sorry, let the talk back continue.
Question for the group, and raise your hands if you can. How many use the term experimental as a positive reflection of their music, or the term experimental as a pejorative, as an apology for the type of music that they make, or as a handy handle, a classification for marketing purposes only?
So first, positive.
Anybody use it in a positive sense, that they like the term and they identify with the term?
Pejorative.
And how many for pejorative?
It's not pejorative.
Why would anybody-
It's a necessary evil because
Well,
you have
that's what I mean by pejorative.
No,
The
but
last thing you said. What was the last
Yeah,
thing
what
you
was
said?
that?
it's not inherently bad.
A handy handle.
A handy handle.
handle. I think that's everybody, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's a
I think it's a handy handle, and the question is not how you feel about experimental, but how you feel about using handy handles to describe your music, which is the same question as, do you want to package this so that it's easy for someone to swallow, or would you rather like go into it and actually describe what it is and throw it on the wall and see if it sticks? So it depends who you're talking to and what you want, or what they want.
Which one makes you look like more of like a know-it-all, or like a person that's like above the other person?
Well, that's a very subjective
That's
question.
what I would want.
I don't think anybody can answer that question. I think it would be different for every person who you ask that to.
Probably.
Just after your name, put the term know-it-all.
Right, David, know-it-all, PhDs.
Nice. Business cards.
Who does like experimental music? Like who comes to, if you say a show is experimental and you say like experimental music festival, like who are these
We
people?
all
You
care.
I mean,
guys.
I know, right? Like I don't know. We do have to acknowledge this room to a certain extent.
Well,
Like,
I
are you
would-
satisfied with that? Sorry. Are you satisfied with your audience?
I want the audience to like I don't want to be like someone who's like listen to what me and my friends do because it's inherently cooler than everything else. Like that's not true. But and I'm not satisfied with my audience, and then I'm not satisfied with like only ever billing these types of things together. But then like I like risky billing. I like when I play with like really just unlike things because I like seeing what happens when the audience is like, what is this? Like
sometimes it works out much better than you would ever expect.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's true. I've had great experiences with that.
Yeah.
But, you know, people don't want to do that really a lot. I feel like it happens more in small towns.
That's what I was gonna say. Small towns,
Yeah,
and that's
'cause
why
then
small
it's
towns
just-
are the best audiences.
Yeah.
You guys play with Black Sparrow in
Yeah.
Lafayette, Indiana?
No, those are horrible audiences.
They're great audiences.
No, they're not. They hate what I've done. I played it twice. They hated it. I put people out, man. I put people out.
Anyway, so this is a perfect reason. Unicat. Speak loud.
I'm still confused about like what people experiment in experimental music, and it always seems to me that there are two levels at least of like of what experimental means when you say experimental music, and one is what individual artists do in their works, and the other is like the whole connection with avant-garde, like more on a social level. So you do a work, and you're not sure if people are going to accept it as music, but you put it there as an experiment. But in this case, like, and I think this was like kind of the original meaning that the term had. But in this case, if the experiment succeeds and people like acknowledge it as music, then it becomes new music or whatever, And so the irony now is that there is people identify experimental music as a term for a genre, which kind of, in my opinion, defies the whole sense that was conveyed in the word. And so that therefore it's very difficult to use the terminology, although there are no other, I don't think experimental music can be replaced by new music unless, the problem is that it can, but.
Now we're dealing with a kind of set theory that music is a particular thing, and that we're looking for the experimental to be something which we're going to float and try to incorporate into the definition of what music is. The absolute best, while simultaneously being the worst thing anyone has ever said about what I've done, is it's not really music, is it? And I know that when I'm kind of I use that now when I'm composing something, I ask myself, well, is it maybe not? I know if I'm kind of treading that edge on where I want to be, doing something that's pushing the envelope a little bit, that's kind of railing against a sort of existential void where I haven't gone before.
So do you think that experimentalism is reactionary?
Well, I think learning shit, right? I think that's an important definition of experimental, and all music's experimental, right? And I think that what people pine at when they do the things they do, whether it's I'm not gonna start listing them, but it's you want to learn something, you want to figure shit out, and that's a fucking experiment, and it's I don't know, but I think there's explicitly not experimental music, and that gets kind of interesting. When people but I don't know if it's possible, but it's maybe it can be interesting to try to think about music, or I guess it starts getting more into the realm of just performance, perhaps. It's more unlike music, So I don't know. That for me, I think experiment is a big term. I want to find out tones and combinations of tones and bass that's satisfying or maybe not satisfying, and I want to figure that out. I want to figure out what happens when all the stuff I programmed kind of comes together with people and other people, and I mix that with another performer, or I have all these inventions, I have these schemes of ways about things, and that seems like a fucking experiment, I sit around and work on just little disparate parts, kind of all day, just kind of cobble things here and there of this big system, and kind of see it all kind of work together. It's rad. I don't know, and you learn something. You figure something out.
So maybe I guess where we started, like, what is experimental? Like, a lot of music is experimental, but it's not experimental.
Right. What's not experimental?
Genre.
Kanye?
Genre music.
Yeah.
But even then, though, I mean, they like pop music. That's like the seems like the
It's like
most
the
successful
That's
experience.
like the real experiment. That's like the success rate is like you sold a shit ton of this like.
But a genre has rules. So a genre has rules. So genre music is like working within but defined by everybody.
Well, we have to talk about
collectively
technique.
defined. But I mean, a genre, like I was just in Texas and I was listening to this genre of music called narco corridos, which is like these like ballads about the drug lords, and it's insane music. It's really cool. Like it's all acoustic. It's horns mainly, and like but their compositions are really complicated sometimes, and every single one is different. But it all fits in the genre. It's a genre, you know. So it's like yeah, they experiment in the sense that they like push their compositions, and some of them are really out. But like it's a genre,
It's
and to me
stylized
that's
in
not
some way.
experimental.
Is it
But that sounds
stylized
like
in some
very-
way?
I don't know. I don't think it's so black and white like that. It's just spectrum. There's
Yeah.
degrees to
But
which
it's a genre.
It doesn't
individualized
necessarily have to
experiment.
be experimentation.
It's
with-
not an experiment.
No, what I'm saying is,
Why
it
not?
doesn't necessarily have to be experimentation with the combinations of tones, with electronics, with the equipment. It can be a social experiment. It can be an experiment to see how this operates socially. And with the drug lords and things, that's the envelope it has chosen
I
to
disagree
push.
because it's not the intention. The intent it just actually developed.
What would you say the intention is?
That's what I mean. I think it's non-intentional. I think it just developed in a culture, and I think that there's intention in experimentality.
Yeah.
You know, there's like an intention.
I agree.
And whereas like if something develops in a culture, it's a little different to
No,
me.
it
But
was
how
more
can
like
something
folk
not
music
develop
in
in
a
a
way.
culture?
Well, like
But
what
like
if?
development is kind of.
Well, they were
should
because
like
there were
experiment.
Norteña ballads, there were northern ballads, and then someone sang one about it. You know, and like you know what I mean? I mean that it developed.
Yeah.
It was a genre that came out of another genre. I just look from the outset, it just looks very different to me.
But doesn't experimental music
Maybe.
come out of our culture? I mean, how
Well,
is that
sure.
culture different?
That's the
nothing's-
question.
But it's
nothing's
individual
created in a
often.
vacuum.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, nothing's created in a vacuum, and the ballads of the drug lords, like they are amazing, and they're not created in a vacuum. They're created in that amazing border music that has existed for decades, and that is really powerful. In the sense that most of the people in this room who have performed tonight are using experimental. They're using it not to identify a genre that has existed organically, but rather a genre that they are subjectively attempting to create.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big difference. I think that Hot Date, for example, like I know a lot of the guys that you guys have played with and the shows that you guys have played and how's this has been going, and that's a whole genre of music that has yet to concoct a name. In addition with Sean Ali, although you can check out a lot of the stuff that Sean does on Prom Night Records, and a lot of it is very similar in really amazing ways. Anastasia, you have a whole group, Silent Idol.
Oh, so it's actually just me.
Yeah, but still.
I trick people constantly.
But
I
still,
trick other people
but still,
sometimes.
she's got a conglomerate that you can get in on, and as does Future Death Toll and TJ Borden performs with a lot of other people. So everybody who's performed tonight has this whole genre that's based around an aesthetic idea that they themselves have subjectively concocted that is separate from an organic process over decades of developing a new genre. And that's why it's interesting that we are able to call their work experimental. So what does experimental mean? Is it scientific? We have kind of concluded, no, it's not. Mostly what I've heard, and please somebody correct me, is that it's a handy catch-all for something that can't be placed, and that, as Robert I don't know the word for it, most cogently said, is a word for a genre that does not yet exist, but that will exist. And I think that everybody who's performed tonight is in the process of creating a new genre of music. Whether they overlap or not is beside the point. But thank you, everyone, for performing. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this discussion. I've learned a lot, and there's a lot of sore eye hanging around a lot for you to check out. Bye, thank you. So hang out. There's lots more beer. We can't make any more noise, but we can definitely listen to music and relax.
Can we do experiments?
No.